Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We appreciate your comments, and we will move on to our third and final panelist here this morning. Isaac Orr is a policy fellow for the Center of the American Experiment. Welcome to Ohio. Welcome to our committee, and we look forward to your presentation.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for having me. Appreciate the invitation to speak here. So I really want to talk about the impact on consumers. This is the Consumer and Generation Impacts Panel, and that's been something that I think needs to be emphasized because ultimately the consumers are your constituents. So about me, I work at Center of the American Experiment. We are a Minnesota-based think tank. I think like a lot of the stuff in my bio is superfluous, but I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. So for me, a lot of the problems that we're seeing now are emblematic of the fact that too many people think milk comes from the grocery store and that electricity comes from the outlet. American Experiment is a leader in energy modeling. So we've modeled the impact of different regulatory regimes, policies, EPA regulations in 11 states, and the Mid-Continent Independent Systems Operator for the ozone transport rule, coal combustion and residual rule, and EPA's carbon rule, proposed carbon rule, and also ozone transport and CCR in Southwest Power Pool. So we are the only organization, to my knowledge, that has modeled the reliability impacts of the EPA's carbon rule, and we found that the grid that EPA thinks will be in existence due to the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies and its rules will result in massive blackouts in the MISO region due to an over-reliance on wind and solar. So for the main takeaways for, I'm sorry, I'm not flipping through this. I apologize for the folks at home. All right, here we go. Our current energy policy is undermining the reliability of the grid and making it more expensive. Blackouts and brownouts are becoming more frequent, and prices are rising in most areas where carbon-free mandates and areas are being hit hard by EPA regulations where those mandates are not in place. I don't want to get too philosophical with everybody, but this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The idea is that when you're hungry, you care about your hunger. When you don't have a place to sleep, you want to find shelter. And as you satisfy these needs at the base of the pyramid, you start to go for more aspirational needs, right? You decide, I want friendship, I want love, I want, esteem from my peers. And we need to think about the energy hierarchy of needs, which is grid reliability first, electricity affordability second, and then decarbonization is that third and final priority that is only attained after you've attained the first two rungs of the pyramid. So this is not a suggestion. This is an order of operations. I know Mr. Robb talked about a three-legged stool, and I think that there's validity to that. But I also think that if you decide that you are going to prioritize carbon-free electricity over reliability and affordability, you're not going to have any of it, and it's going to look like Germany, where you're turning coal plants back on after you retire your nuclear fleet. So in that regard, Ohio's been a leader. I think that we not only need to pump the brakes on retiring existing nuclear, natural gas, and coal plants, but slam on them, and that has been something that's been happening in MISO. So Minnesota is we're very involved in MISO in Minnesota. So we are kind of the ghost of Christmas future for you all, right? So when it comes to that, the first rule of holes is to stop digging. So NERC's long-term reliability assessment said that MISO is the region most at risk of rolling blackouts moving forward. And that's because we're retiring too many thermal plants. There are 35,000 megawatts of coal that is scheduled to go offline in the period there. Oh, sorry. There we go. I do it here, and I'm so used to it automatically doing it.
I'll do it for you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Teamwork makes the dream work. And PJM is a major supplier of electricity for us. We basically depend on you. When I'm at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission talking about why Xcel should be extending the life of a coal plant rather than retiring it, they say, oh, well, we'll import from our neighbors when we need the power most. And the problem with kind of a California-style energy policy is eventually you run out of other people's electricity. And that's where we're all headed. So just some of the policies that are undermining grid reliability: state-level mandates for 100% carbon-free electricity, federal subsidies for wind and solar, EPA regulations that will force more coal and natural gas plants to retrofit, retire, or operate less frequently, and then grid reliability is declining as the U.S. and Canada have experienced more blackouts and near misses. I don't know how many of you were following the events in Alberta, Canada, but things got very tight up there, and one of the main reasons for Alberta having such a tight situation, it was too cold for the wind turbines to blow. So at negative 22, wind turbines basically stop operating in order to prevent them from breaking. Not only that, but during these periods, they are consuming power from the grid generated from coal, nuclear, and natural gas plants and hydro to keep the heaters in the wind turbines operational, right? So probably does not get negative 22 in Ohio. It sure does in Minnesota and Iowa and North Dakota. And, you know, if we talk about the transmission problem, a lot of people say, well, we need more transmission to where the wind resources are. What if we build that and it's still not blowing? Because at negative 22, you're guaranteed not to have it. And I can guarantee you that's when you're going to want the power the most. So in Alberta, the wind was performing, there's 4,481 megawatts of installed capacity, and it was producing 14 megawatts of power when the chips were down and they needed it most. They were within 10 megawatts of initiating a load shed during a polar vortex, which is not where you want to be. The same thing happens in MISO, and it doesn't even need to be a polar vortex. It can just be a good old-fashioned wind drought. So the image on your screen shows the hourly wind generation for the entire MISO footprint. That is a 15-state footprint going from North Dakota to Mississippi, Louisiana, so basically whole mid-continent. So this entire MISO wind fleet of 22,000 megawatts, you can see that on the red line, was producing less than a single coal facility in North Dakota that has 1,100 megawatts, right? And they did that for, the wind drought was significant. It was an 80-hour period where wind was producing less than 10% of its potential output, and for 42 straight hours, it was less than 1.5%. So when I think it was Mr. Robb was talking about how you need to overbuild your grid by a factor of 5 to 7 in order to match the thermal output of a thermal plant. Well, sometimes that's true, but sometimes you need even more. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Throughout the years, PJM, MISO, they focused on meeting peak demand. But as we shift towards a grid that has more unreliable, intermittent weather sources, right, we also need to manage not only the peaks of electricity demand, but the valleys of wind and solar generation, which I think this slide conveys pretty well. So I want to talk to you about the challenges that are coming from the EPA's proposed carbon rule. My colleague Mitch Rolling and I looked through all of the regulatory impact analysis, which is a dense document that EPA puts out justifying its rule. And in their spreadsheets, EPA thinks that coal will be virtually gone from the MISO system by 2035, which is more aggressive than NERC believes in their long-term reliability assessment. And to a large extent, that's only going to be replaced with wind turbines and solar panels. So the red or the dots signify what the installed capacity of the system. So you basically more than double the installed capacity of the system over time. So what we did is we said, can this system meet the demands of consumers every hour of every day based on historical hourly electricity demand patterns and wind and solar capacity factors? And you find out that it can. Remember that wind drought I showed you earlier? If we have another event like that, we will have a period where we have massive blackouts in the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator area. It's 20,000 megawatts. That's enough to black out my home state of Wisconsin and my new state of Minnesota simultaneously, right? So if you're rolling those blackouts, that is a huge amount of electricity that is not going to be available. And there's also, I want to talk about the EPA regulations just a little bit more. There was a question earlier, what's disincentivizing thermal generation to enter the markets here? And this is a big one, right? So under these rules, anyone who builds a combined cycle natural gas plant would have to have that hydrogen ready by, I think it's 2030 or 2035. Within the next 20 years, let's just say. This green hydrogen doesn't exist, and I think that the fuel cost alone is close to 10 times the cost of natural gas, right? So EPA the Congress through the Inflation Reduction Act is trying to subsidize it, bring it down, but ultimately they're hoping that this strategy works out. There's a way you can get around that if you have a combined cycle plant. It's if you run that plant less than 50% of the time, right? So you could theoretically cheese your way through EPA's regulations by building a bunch of gas generators, but not running them very frequently. That's very capital intensive, and companies aren't going to do that, right? So I think that there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty that's been placed into these markets on top of I'm not a PJM expert, so I'm not going to talk about why PJM hasn't had enough thermal generation entering, but for MISO, that's been a big problem. And costs are rising quickly. So we're often told that wind and solar are the cheapest forms of electricity, but this isn't true when you account for the fact that you need to have a reliable source of electricity all the time. And when you account for these hidden costs, it's a lot more. So this slide that you're seeing right here, we modeled the impact of Minnesota's 100% carbon-free mandate, and we said, okay, if you tried to meet this with nuclear power, you'd only need about 16,379 megawatts of installed capacity in order to meet Minnesota's peak load. If you were going to do that with wind turbines, solar panels, and battery storage, it's currently illegal to build new nuclear power plants in Minnesota. You'd need 100,455 megawatts of installed capacity. So that delta is going to be borne by the consumer. And that's why, there's no way to decarbonize for cheap, right? I think that's just, other than going from coal to natural gas, that's the easy part. And then it's only hard parts from there on. So building the nuclear power plants would be $90 billion through 2050. Building all that wind, solar, transmission lines, and battery storage would be $313 billion for a state of 6 million, or 5.8 million people. So when you decide that you're going to put all of those extra costs onto the levelized cost of energy for wind and solar, it's much more expensive than your existing thermal plants, right? So the existing coal plants in Minnesota, $35 a megawatt hour. Natural gas, 28, 27. Our existing nuclear fleet, 37. But if you're going to take into account the fact that you need to overbuild your system and curtail the renewables when you have too much, then the cost of wind goes to $272 a megawatt hour, and solar jumps up to $471. The sun isn't super useful. We have about a 5% capacity factor for wind or for solar in Minnesota in January. So consumers benefit the most from reliable, dispatchable energy systems. Increasing our reliance on weather is the dirty, hairy energy policy. Just ask yourself, do I feel lucky? And costs will rise while reliability falters. It's the worst of both worlds. So if you have questions, comments, or scathing rebuttal, you have my contact information, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And some might ask why we would include a presentation from primarily what's happening in MISO, but I think they are a harbinger to what